Don't worry, guys, more War of the Immortals is coming soon. In fact, I've even got some builds in mind for the new classes and class archetypes. But before that, I gotta finish my Fear the Darkness party. Hello, team players. Today we're building the Shadow Mauler. Let's dive in. Today we are building a fighter. That means technically no subclass and no spells. But we do want to use two-handed weapons in this build, as those do the most damage, and we are trying to be a damage dealer in this build, as that is the one thing that this party is missing. For stats, we're going with strength as the most important, obviously. We want to do as much damage as possible. Then constitution for our defense, and wisdom. The last thing this build wants to do is get controlled. So we need good will saves. And fighters don't have good will saves, which is why we need high wisdom to compensate for that. The only skill I can recommend in this build is athletics. We're going to be tripping people in this build, even though we are using a two-handed weapon. Everything else is pretty much discretionary. We're not going to need much else. I would have also recommended intimidation, but once we hit level 2, we're going to take a feat that's going to make demoralize pretty much useless. But you can take it if you want to. Really, what you take besides athletics is going to depend on your campaign. And charisma-based skills can be useful outside of combat. But yes, you'll need athletics, but otherwise take what you want. Now let's talk feats. First, we're going with Vicious Swing. One of the things we want to do in this build is massive damage, especially to enemies that are outside of our Witch's Darkness. Those we want to deal with first. Those enemies are the ones we really have to worry about, and this will let us do good damage to them even if they have good resistances. Now, damage isn't the only thing we want to do with this build, but it is one of the main ones. But we'll talk about that when we get to other feats in this build. Moving on, our second level feat is going to be Intimidating Strike. This is why we don't need intimidation. For battle, anyway. We can make a melee strike, and if we hit, the target is frightened 1, or frightened 2 if we crit. And we're a fighter, so we're going to crit a lot. This does take 2 actions. However, this party is about fear, and this will work extremely well with our champion's aura, as we can just keep them frightened. And we can do this on multiple enemies. Not per round, but we can do it on multiple enemies. And even if enemies aren't in the champion's aura of despair, we can do this multiple times because they don't become immune. This is why this feat is better than the demoralize action. Although, like I said in the skill section, you may still want intimidation for out of combat. In addition to frightening the enemy, we also want to put them on the ground so they have to waste actions, in addition to triggering our reactive strike. So, we'll also be taking Slam Down. Now we can attack an enemy and trip them both at full attack bonus. The main thing here is making an enemy waste an action that they could be spending either attacking us or our allies, or getting out of the darkness. This is mainly going to help when enemies decide to take the mental damage from the champion's reaction, as now they're on the ground and taking the persistent mental damage, which is very, very good. So, our 6th level feat is going to be Shatter Defenses. First of all, number 1, this will work extremely well when our enemies have high reflex saves and aren't going to be tripped easily, as this will allow us to make an attack, and if they're frightened, make them off guard. 2, enemies at this point might be able to see through the Witch's Darkness because they have dark vision, which means that they won't be off guard to us, as the darkness spell only really makes them off guard indirectly, as they have to be hidden from us in order to actually be off guard. Plus, this will be very useful for enemies that aren't in the Witch's Darkness. Later on, of course, the Witch will be able to cast the greater version of Darkness, which means a lot more enemies are going to be off guard against our attacks. But it is going to be useful even then. Because again, Enemies with high reflex saves are going to be extremely hard to trip. And this will make them off guard if they're frightened, which we have multiple ways in this party of making the foe frightened. And this will be extremely useful with our champions Aura of Despair, because they are off guard as long as they are frightened. And if they're already off guard, then we can keep them frightened until the start of our next turn. So even if they're not in the champion's aura, we can keep them frightened for a little while. Very good feat for this build and this party. Next, of course, we are going to be taking blind fights. I mean, it's a no-brainer here. Even if we choose an ancestry that has dark vision, eventually the witch is going to be able to drop that greater dark vision. And the ranger isn't always going to help us see through it. Which means blind fight is going to help a lot. As even when the witch drops that 4th rank darkness, we're still going to be able to at least attack. And plus, even if the ranger can help us see through it, they're still going to be concealed to us. But we no longer have to make the flat check to target concealed creatures if we have blind fights. Next, we'll be taking the greater version of Slam Down, Crashing Slam. Effectively, when we use Slam Down, we no longer have to make the check to trip them. We essentially just automatically get a crit success on the trip. And we can use our weapon damage die for the extra damage from a critical trip, since we're using a two-handed weapon. So as long as we hit, we are tripping every foe, regardless of their reflex saving throws. And we get to do extra damage on top of that. We are still going to want Shatter Defenses, because if enemies are off guard when we hit them with it, then we keep them frightened. That part is why we need Shatter Defenses now. And for when we don't trip them, but enemies decide to kneel before the champion with the Iron Command choice. And again, tripping them makes them waste an action and triggers our Reactive Strike. Very useful here. At level 12, it's Tactical Reflexes. Essentially, we get an extra reaction that we can use only for Reactive Strike. Which means if there are two enemies prone, whether that's from us tripping them or our champion's Iron Command, we get hit both of them. And remember, we're going to be doing massive damage in this build, since we're using a two-handed weapon and we're going to crit a lot. Very useful to have a second Reactive Strike. Next, we'll be taking Lunge. This effectively gives us a 10-foot reach with our two-handed melee weapon. And if the weapon has this disarm, shove, or trip trait, we can use that instead of a strike. Unfortunately, we can't use this with Vicious Swing or Intimidating Strike. But not needing to be in the actual darkness in order to attack is pretty nice. And of course, this also means we don't have to move around as much, which means we won't trigger reactions as much. And our weapon is more than likely going to have the shove trait, if any of those traits, since it's a two-handed weapon, which means we can shove people into the darkness at reach. Pretty nice. And of course, because we have lunge, we might as well take lunging stance. This effectively allows us to go into a stance that allows us to make our reactive strikes from reach. Now we especially don't have to move around as much, because we can make reactive strikes from reach. And we will be taking a second stance here with Disrupting Stance. This allows us to use our reactive strike when an enemy tries to do a concentrate action in addition to manipulate and move actions. In addition, if we hit the target, we disrupt that action. We don't need to critically hit anymore to do that. So if that barbarian decides to rage in front of us, well, guess what? We get to hit them, and they now have to use an action to actually rage. And of course, it does work with other concentrate actions too. But we are going to have to decide whether we want to be in lunging stance or disruptive stance, depending on the situation. But they're both really good stances here. Which one you go into is ultimately going to depend on what you're facing or the situation. And finally, for our capstone, we're going to be taking Weapon Supremacy. We're permanently quickened, but we can only use the extra action to strike. This is going to be very useful for when enemies are further away. And we want to do massive damage in this build, so we do want to be attacking quite a bit, even at that -10. At the end of the day, we are a fighter, and we want to do as much damage as possible in this build. And being a fighter, in addition to the ranger sharing his Hunter's Edge benefit with us, is actually going to make us hit a lot more often than you would think, even on that third and fourth attack. So if you're playing this build this far into it, you are definitely going to want to take this. No spells here, but we can talk about free archetype. The first archetype I recommend for this build is the Mauler. It's got quite a few feats that will really help this build that you won't be able to get as a fighter. Things like Shoving Sweep, allowing you to use a reaction to keep enemies in the darkness. Although that really isn't something that this build is designed to do, but it can be useful. The second archetype I recommend for this build is the Barbarian archetype. Raging is just more damage for this build, and you're going to be able to do things that a fighter wouldn't normally be able to do as well. Moving on, I also have the Exemplar archetype. There are a few icons that can help this build, especially the Titan Breaker. And Exemplar can help you do spirit damage, which can also help you get over enemy resistances, as well as just more damage. All of these are fantastic options for your free archetype with this build. Now, let's talk about Ancestries. The first Ancestry I recommend for this build is Leshy. Leshy has almost perfect ability boost for this build, and a few feats that are definitely going to help us out. For example, we can take Anchoring Roots in order to make it harder for enemies to push us around, and we can take Grasping Reach to effectively give us a 15-foot reach once we pick up Lunge, which is absolutely ridiculous for a two-handed weapon. For Heritage, I recommend the Root Leshy. It has more hit points, and we can combine that Heritage with the Anchoring Roots feat in order to make it really difficult to push us around or trip us. The second Ancestry that I recommend for this build is Dwarf, for basically the same reason that we chose Dwarf for our champion. Almost perfect stats for this build in the ability boosts. Boulder Roll to push enemies into the darkness, Mountain Stoutness for more hit points, and we can even take Divide the Darkness for greater dark vision. For Heritage, I recommend the Rock Dwarf to, again, make it harder for enemies to push us around or trip us. In addition, we're only moved half the distance if someone forces us to move, which is very handy. The last Ancestry I recommend for this build is Orc, for the entire line of Orc Ferocity feats, to keep us up, plain and simple. And it's got good hit points in addition to that. Speaking of hit points, we're going to go with the Hold Scarred Orc Heritage. Even more hit points than we're already getting, and Die Hard as a free feat to, again, keep us up. And that's going to do it for this build. If you guys enjoyed this video, go ahead and leave a like, and do all that other YouTube stuff. Subscribe, whatever. And remember, I'm also on Twitch, so keep that in mind. I play Baldur's Gate 3 on there, so look for that. And if you guys are interested in the other 3 builds in this party, I now have the entire party right here. Thank you guys so much for watching, and remember, teamwork is vital. It helps us solve problems.